Okay, everyone, I think we'll make a start. Thank you for dialing in this evening. My name is Chris. I'm the current president of UXPA UK, and I'd like to welcome you to our July event on the subject of UX in healthcare. Some of you may be joining us for the first time. Some of you may have attended a few of our recent remote events, or you may be an old timer from the face-to-face events, and obviously we hope to get those back up and running as soon as possible in line with advice. Obviously for the short to medium term, we will keep the events online for now. Just a little bit about UXPA UK. We are the local chapter of an international organisation, and we have been going for about 18 years supporting the UX industry in the UK. We are run entirely by volunteers, so we put these events together in our spare time, our evenings, our weekends, our cheeky lunch breaks, and we thank you all for your participation. Normally, in normal circumstances, we are a bit more active in terms of face-to-face events and workshops. However, obviously, as you can imagine, the events over the past few months have slowed that down, so we have been moving online recently. However, we also have a very popular mentoring scheme. So if you are interested in finding a mentor or indeed being a mentor and helping out the community in that way, we'd very much like to hear from you. Just a note for the diary that our events are normally the third Thursday of the month. So the next one will be on August the 20th on the subject of research ops. We're still putting the details together and they will go out in the newsletter in due course. At UXPA UK, we pride ourselves on putting together events that have strong topics, and I think in light of the circumstances, this is probably one of the most relevant topics we've ever had, rightly or wrongly, or sadly given the circumstances. UX in healthcare is critical at the moment, and I think the talks we're going to have this evening are going to shed a light on what is such an important industry. We have representatives from AstraZeneca. Obviously, they've been in the news quite a lot recently. Their CEO has been on the BBC quite often speaking about the current situation. So we're going to hear insights about how AZ are responding to and adapting their work over the years. We're also being asked to make sacrifices, and we've all been asked to give up things that we would normally enjoy. And that's been hard for many people, and we've seen examples of the news of where people can accept that for a certain amount of time, but then after a few weeks or a few months, people's resistance starts to break, and we've seen some very common examples in the news. And this is going to be an ongoing topic. You know, the topic of face masks is in the news heavily at the moment, and I don't want to make this about politics, but I saw there was a story yesterday in the House of Commons where an MP referred to face masks as monstrous impositions. So if we're getting advice in one ear and then we're hearing comments like that from another source, changing behaviour can be really challenging, and I think Rosie will provide a lot of the background and context for that. Just in terms of how this evening's going to run, there'll be two talks. You can submit your questions during the talk using the chat feature, and we'll keep an eye on those. Or at the end of each talk, we will invite questions from the attendees. You will all be muted by default, but if you raise your hand using the Q&A feature, I can unmute you. And if you'd rather ask your question in person, we can do it that way. Either way, we're happy to deal with whichever you prefer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speakers, Filippa and Voula from AstraZeneca. You should now be able to share your screen and you can unmute yourselves.
Thank you.
Okay, just sharing our screen here.
Can you guys see this? Can you hear us? Can you guys hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep, we can hear you. Sorry, it's only me that can speak.
Okay, well, thank you everyone, and thanks for having us. I have to admit that when we were discussing with Chris the possibility of me and Filippa coming and talking to you, it was before Christmas. Both Filippa and I were quite excited to come to London and to one of your nice venues and have some beers and snacks and chat to all of you. Sadly, that's not possible. However, we're still excited because given the pandemic and given the times that we're going through, our talk and what we do in pharma is really relevant and really topical. So we're still very much excited. Okay, so starting off today, we wanted to come and talk to you about UX practice in pharma, really. What does that look like? What are the challenges that we're facing? How we overcome this? And what does it look like? You know, what kinds of things do you do as a UX person in pharma? Over the past 10 years, the pharmaceutical industry has gone through a huge transformation, moving from a sort of systems approach, system-centered approach and a drug-centered approach to more of a new paradigm of patient centricity. And this was kind of in line with the whole digital transformation of healthcare. And this has created huge opportunities for us, for UX people, to be involved in work where we can reimagine how we engage with patients and HCPs, support science and support them in developing new knowledge and create new medications to be able to diagnose, to be able to detect, to be able to even predict the onset of diseases sooner. So we hope that our talk today will give you a flavor of the exciting opportunities there are when it comes to user-centered design in pharma. And just for a quick introduction, my name is Voula, Gkatzidou. You can see that both mine and Filippa's surnames are very complicated, so we've added the phonetic transcription there. I'm a UX researcher. I have an academic background and worked in various areas of human-centered design, inclusive design, automotive design, and for the past 5 years I've been working in healthcare design. That kind of has my heart.
And I'm Filippa, so I'm also UX designer here at AstraZeneca. I've been here for about 2 years now, or just under, and I'm involved in the research and design. And this is actually my first role in pharma or healthcare. So my background is in, well, my previous experience is in B2B marketing, UX for home energy, smart energy, and also in database development software. So all very different to pharma and healthcare. So it's quite an exciting time and space for me at the moment. So we thought we'd just introduce you to our team a little bit. So the global UX team is about 5 years old, so it's still quite a young team. We're made up of 17 designers and researchers, all multidisciplinary. So some of us have backgrounds in product design, some are psychology, and some have backgrounds in computer science. And we work across the UK, China, and the US. And we are a centralized team, so we operate almost like an agency within the wider business. So we work across the business to support internal and external projects, and we'll go into a bit more about that a bit later. So yeah, as I mentioned, we work on a mix of internal colleague-facing projects as well as external projects for people like patients and doctors. And you might know this already, but clinical trials are critical to what we do in pharma and at AstraZeneca. So without clinical trials, there'd be no new drugs without being able to trial them first and test them. So there's different stages of clinical trials, starting off with healthy volunteers trialing drugs for safety, through to patients who are suffering with a very specific condition, and we're trialing drugs for efficacy. And lots of the work that we do in the user experience team is related some way to the clinical trials that we're running. So it could be supporting the business in designing or planning or running clinical trials for new drugs, or to use for a new use for an existing product that we already have. And to give you an example of the sort of project that we've worked on recently that was similar to this was about, it was a project about understanding if and how we could use digital to improve the clinical trial experience for patients, doctors, and internal AstraZeneca employees working on those clinical trials as well. And a lot of this project was all about running research to empathise with the mindsets and behaviours of the patients and doctors in order to explore where the biggest pain points were, so that we could see where the biggest opportunities for us to help and make a difference to these user experiences. And other projects that we might be working on that are similar to this, but slightly different in that we would be supporting maybe patients with a very specific condition. So, for example, chronic kidney disease, we might be helping a patient to manage their disease better and live with their disease, or increase awareness of a specific disease to improve earlier diagnosis and treatment. So an example of this type of project was recently we worked on a project where we were researching the area of heart failure, and we found that there was very little awareness of heart failure in general, and the main pain points were around the diagnosis experience for doctors and patients. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of some of the types of the external patient and doctor facing projects that we tend to work on.
A lot of the work that we do also covers internal facing tools, systems and services. And what that means, it could cover a range of work from the creation of digital tools to support our scientists with being able to find scientific data and build on those insights, to creating really bespoke, specific analytic systems, or having an input on physical workspaces like lab workspaces, and even through the design or redesign of existing business processes. Our internal facing work also covers a lot of work in terms of the websites and tools that all the AstraZeneca employees use, from redesigning travel booking tools to HR websites, intranets, and so on. Also, a lot of the work that we do falls in the remit of training and being able to mentoring our colleagues in order to build capabilities within the company to sort of instill the user-centered design processes and mindset across the organization to as many departments as we possibly can.
And because we're a centralized team, like I said earlier, and we're working across the business globally, we have a load of different users that we're designing for. And actually, this is probably one of the biggest challenges, but one of the most interesting challenges that we have as a UX team. So just to give you an idea of the types of users that we design for, there's obviously like the patients and the doctors that I mentioned earlier. And there's also caregivers, and in those groups of people, there's actually loads of different kind of sub users as well. So when we think about patients, it's not just one group of people. It's you've got to think of people. They could be anybody of different ages, different conditions. They could have different severities of various different conditions, which can affect their needs quite a lot. They could be acute or chronic conditions. They might have different technical abilities. They might be in different locations, which then brings in the cultural differences as well. So just in that one group of patients, there's actually loads of different things that we have to consider. But then there's also, as Voula was talking about earlier, the internal users, which could be scientists, or and these scientists even could be lots of various different types of scientists. So there's like the early science people, the late scientists, people that work in labs, people that design these clinical trials, could be data scientists. And then we have other colleagues as well, such as sales reps or finance, procurement. So the list is very long of who our users are.
Okay, so let's start by asking the most basic question we can ask of why pharma? Why did we choose to do UX in pharma? Because I assume some of you are thinking, well, pharma is not very much well loved as an industry. Pharma is not very popular. In fact, I think in terms of its popularity, it ranks together with the tobacco industry and arms manufacturers. So why did we choose to do UX in pharma? And I think the answer that we give mostly now is that if the pandemic taught us one thing, is that it highlighted the need for medicine and the need to be able to respond to an unprecedented healthcare crisis. There is a need for people like pharmacologists and scientists to research and develop drugs and medicines to treat us, to prevent us from having a condition, to keep us and our families healthy. There's also a need for an industry, the pharmaceutical industry, to be there to support those scientists. And because frankly, the alternative would be much scarier, because the alternative would be hospitalization, would be operations, would be emergency rooms and so on. So for me, if you were to personally ask me why pharma, I'd probably say just making an impact. And what that really means is that I wanted my work to make a difference. I wanted to make an impact on patients and their lives and on people's life, especially when they are the most vulnerable, which is when they are sick. I also, what's really important to me is also the fact that I came from an academic scientific background. So to me, it's very important to be able to do work to support the science and help them innovate and make it possible for them to innovate and collaborate and create new things. So, but mostly, I have to admit, mostly it's about the impact. So for example, the team is working on a project about that's trying to map the patient experience for ovarian cancer patients. So this is a piece of work that really goes in depth of the entire pathway of ovarian cancer patients, from prevention to screening to diagnosis, treatment, and or to end of life. Because this is what is slightly different in pharma, that sometimes the end of an experience map is end of life. So this is the kind of work that will be able to shape and inform both the way we as a company predict the condition, but also how we treat people and the experience of those patients and those families.
And the other reason, so we actually spoke with our team when we were coming up with these reasons for wanting to work in pharma, and so the other reason that our team mentioned is having new opportunities and challenges. So because digital in pharma and healthcare in general is still quite immature, it actually brings up loads of exciting opportunities and complex challenges that haven't yet been solved elsewhere. So things like, how might we get patients to adhere to taking their medication, or how can we keep patients engaged on clinical trials when some of these clinical trials go on for years, and some of these conditions that these patients have are quite severe. Or things like, how could we trigger a behavioural change in an industry that's still in the early stages of its digital journey, and still quite often reliant on very manual processes. So yeah, and there's also loads of opportunities to make massive impacts combining the cutting edge science with the new technology in healthcare. So things like wearables, connected medical devices, and now the ability to meet people virtually mean things like remote clinical trials and patient self-reporting are all things that are possible now. And obviously these have massive benefits to the patients, but the business as well. So there's lots of opportunities there.
So when we were preparing this, we thought, well, let's look at the perceptions that we had before we joined pharma, and see whether they match the reality. So for me, if I could choose one picture to represent what I thought doing UX in pharma would look like, would probably be something like this. And if we were to slightly untangle this, is we're looking at a adventure here. It has like a road trip feeling to it. I can say unexplored landscape, dry, barren land that's waiting for someone to sort of explore it and create. And also the other thing that to me is perfect for this picture is that there is a road. It's not off-piste. It's not. There's a proper paved road there and a car there. So how hard can it be? Surely this should be a bit of an easy ride and a bit of a, it can't be that difficult, right?
So the reality didn't quite match up with that. So we felt like this picture represents the reality really. So you know where you're going, and it is an exciting journey, and you're excited to get there, but it can be really difficult to get there. So it's not quite the direct path you imagined. Something that might have taken you one day might take 2 weeks within Pharma. But you know that, the rain will clear, the traffic will go, you'll eventually get there. But these challenges are mostly down to the sensitive nature of the work that we do. So often with patients, there's a massive importance of being compliant in the way that we work with them, what we say, what we do, and the knowledge that we gain as well. So we wanted to share with you a few of the biggest challenges that we faced along the way, and hopefully share some lessons we've learned in trying to overcome these challenges too.
Okay, so let's start with mentioning some challenges. I think for me, the biggest challenge that the team faces is the lack of appreciation. And what I mean by this is that digital and UX are still very much immature in pharma, and much more immature than other industries like retail, telecommunications, banking, and so on. So what that means that in a lot of respects we have to go back to basics, and by that I mean that we have to pay a lot of attention and focus a lot in having these conversations about user-centeredness, about the value of user-centered design, about the importance of user research, about the importance of the patient's voice. So to me, it's very much user-centered design at grassroots levels, where you have to sell and you have to constantly remind and highlight the value of user-centered design. Another additional layer of complexity here is that a lot of senior leaders in pharma and a lot of decision makers have been in pharma in the same industry all their lives, and they're very much set in the ways they're thinking and working. So new digital ways of thinking, like agile or lean, or maybe new mindsets of problem solving, like design thinking, are met with suspicion and are met with a bit of a resistance. So the challenge for us that we constantly have to deal with is that we need to push to shift those perceptions that UX is not just something of new or something that's a bonus or the cherry on the top, but it's in fact really, really important to engage with right from the beginning.
So another challenge that we face is that we have proactive and reactive projects. So depending on the type of project we're working on, we have to make sure that we adapt our approach accordingly. So there's pros and cons of proactive and reactive projects. So proactive projects tend to be the ones that are huge and highly impactful, with a good budget and timelines to do UX properly. However, sometimes they're so big, sometimes going on for years, and they have massive teams and lots of stakeholders. So sometimes teams could be hundreds of people. And that can make it really difficult to kind of follow the fail fast and iterate approach that we would like to do. But on the other hand, the reactive projects, they're usually much smaller teams reacting quickly to an issue or an imminent need. So there's much fewer stakeholders and fewer team members to convince about doing things the right way. However, the short time frames that these projects often have can be a barrier to doing user-centered design properly. So a recent example, a topical example of this type of project was or is a COVID testing COVID testing for people who are working in the labs and on the manufacturing sites in AstraZeneca. So obviously it was critical that we could get them tested and get these testing systems up and running as quickly as possible, so that they knew that they could go to work safely, and they were reassured that they were in a safe environment. So we had to tweak our usual user-centered design approach and process in order to work with these tight time frames. And as a result, so some of the adaptations we had to make, we had to run research interviews in parallel to building the product itself, and also usability test it after it had been released, which isn't obviously ideal, but this is a very extreme example and an extreme situation. And I think it's a good one that highlights the way that we have to adapt to project needs.
Another challenge that I think will be echoed by a lot of you who work in healthcare is the access to patients. The perception I had before joining Pharma, and after years of working in the public sector and in the NHS, is that I thought, yay, finally I'll be able to speak to people really easily without those long drawn ethics approvals. However, that's not the case. One of the biggest challenges that we face is that the ethical considerations of doing ethnographic research with HCPs, healthcare professionals, and patients are still there. So, you know, that's the first layer of complexity. The additional layer of complexity is that we are a commercial organization, which means there are very strict compliance rules as to even when we do manage to speak to patients, what we can say and what we can't say. We have to constantly be aware of when we interview people, of their perception. You know, we can't be seen to be selling a drug. So when we talk about someone with diabetes, we cannot be mentioning any of our products because it might be seen that, you know, us trying to sell it. At the same time, we have very strict reporting procedures when someone discusses their experience with taking a particular drug, because then we have the whole confusing world of adverse events and very, very strict guidelines that we have to adhere to. So then we have these additional complexities that make research with patients quite challenging. Another challenge in that sort of category is also being able to define the sample of the people that we want to interview. Sometimes we work in projects that are so big that it's very difficult to sort of come up with a representative sample and then recruit that sample. So there has been recently an acceleration of the effort to run visitless clinical trials, which means that because of COVID, we want people who are on clinical trials to continue them, but from home. So there's a lot of work that we're doing to be able to support that model. And part of the work is focusing on how we can transform the lengthy informed consent processes when someone agrees to participate in the trial with a lengthy jargon documents into an online experience, a digital experience. So when you try to gather the requirements of all those people who might be using this, we're talking about a vast range of conditions, severity of conditions, clinical trial phases, ages, countries, and so on. So we're looking, it's impossible to actually come up with any sort of mechanism to say this is a representative sample and then let's recruit that sample. So that's an additional challenge that we're facing due to the nature of our work.
Another challenge is having quite legacy systems. So because obviously it's still in its infancy, digital within pharma, people are still using systems that they've used for a long time, and these can be a little bit clunky. They can be a bit slow, and the people using them, despite feeling the frustrations that they get from these almost bad user experiences of some of these systems, they have used the tool for a long period of time. They're used to kind of finding their own workarounds. They're used to using these systems. And the thought of relearning something new, whether its user experience is better or not, can also often take a lot of persuasion, and it can be quite daunting, and there can often be resistance. So yes, and there's a lot of third-party solutions that are used, third-party vendor solutions and systems across pharma, which means that people are in and out of various different user interfaces with very disjointed user experiences through their roles and through the tasks that they're completing. And I think as our UX team, we have to understand that there are some things that we can change, but there's also things that we aren't quite able to change at the moment. Because obviously we can't have control over third-party vendor systems, and we can't always have a say in what can change and what we can redesign and things like that. So yeah, I think it can be difficult to have a big impact sometimes when technology is third party, but we're definitely moving in the right direction with that.
Another challenge that we're facing, and which we think is specific to pharma, it's the increased need for us to prove measurable difference and prove the business impact that we're making compared to other industries. Now, I know that a lot of you are thinking, well, we all have to do this, we all have to show how, metrics for success. But for us, it's a bit more complicated because our product is drug. We don't design cars or mobile phones or handbags. Our mantra in AstraZeneca is follow the science. So we have a very much a scientific approach and a scientific, we put a scientific caps on it. And the way the paradigm that they use to measure success is very different to the one we use in user experience to measure success. Theirs is a bit more black and white, ours is a bit more, 50 shades of gray. So, we are the ones that keep saying, design never ends, let's do another round of testing and redesign to make the gray slightly whiter and so on. So these two do not go hand in hand. Sometimes we find that we need to push really hard to put those UX metrics in a project's roadmap for success. So when we look at that checklist of what we have to do to show that we're successful, the UX metrics and the user experience of the patients is there, and it goes beyond the sort of the business success metrics like more sales or reduced cost or the metrics from the service provider, so the hospital, or the receiver of care, which is better quality of life and so on. So that's our challenge, to constantly make a case. And sometimes it's hard for us to show the impact that we're making in terms of quantitative metrics, but it is there, though we might need to take a bit longer to sort of prove it. So yeah.
So those are some of the challenges that we face, and some of which we have overcome and some of which are still work in progress, and we're continuing to work on. But we'd like to share with you now some ways that we've adapted and some of the lessons we've learned. So first, because of the immaturity of UX in pharma, there is a heightened importance for us and our team to train and build awareness of the importance of UX. So as a team, we split our time between dedicated project work and smart training, mentoring, and supporting specific groups of people, such as business analysts or leadership team, to apply a user-centered approach to projects. And the reason I mentioned business analysts there is because often they are involved in projects from the very beginning. So if we can kind of convert them to the UX and the user-centered design way of thinking, then they can kind of champion that from the very beginning of these projects and either involve us or involve the team in trying to take that sort of approach. And the training that we do can be in various different formats. We train in different formats. So we have online and remote training, which is really useful for getting quite a broad reach globally. So we train globally. We have face-to-face classroom style training, and we find that works really well in engaging teams, getting them doing hands-on activities, and actually putting some of the stuff that they learn into practice. And the other type of training that we do, which is probably the most time consuming, is customized training. So this is training where we might work with a project team or a group of people who are working on similar projects. and use some of their projects as the case studies that we wrap our training around. So we get them to do activities based on the actual projects that they're working on at that point in time. And it means that they can put what they're learning into practice right away on a project that is that resonates with them. But the challenge that we face here then is constantly, how much time do we spend on training versus how much time do we spend on project work? And finally on this one is another critical thing that we do is actually networking and building and maintaining relationships across the business. So we want to make sure that people are aware of us, they're aware of what we do, what we can offer, to make sure that we'll be pulled into projects at the right time at the early stages where we can make the biggest impact and difference.
Also, another way we overcome some of the challenges that we mentioned is that we offer tailored UX, and what that means is there's two streams to it. Tailored in the regards of we have to constantly keep tailoring our own UX toolkit. From what you've heard so far, you hopefully got a glimpse of the wide range of projects we're working on, which means that we have to constantly refresh our UX research and design skills to be able to catch up with those. You know, we have to learn new skills all the time about how, you know, from creating conversational interfaces for medication adherence to learning all about behavioral science and how we can apply that to help people retain, you know, help with retention for clinical trials. So we constantly find that we have to keep learning and keep tailoring our approaches when it comes to our toolkit. And the other stream of tailored UX is that a lot of the times when we offer services, we work closely with the teams to find out what they need from us, you know, what we can offer them to prove value in the time and effort that, you know, in the least time and effort possible, and all that we offer them options of what we can do for them and tailor it to their project and show them what each of these options, what kind of value and impact it would have to their work.
And the final lesson learned and overcoming of some of these challenges we've had is about working smart, so smart UX. So adapting, as Voula was saying, adapting the way we work. So we make sure that our multidisciplinary team is distributed throughout the organisation, physically and virtually, and that we're not bound to a specific department or a specific therapy area or product team. And by doing this, means that we can be really flexible and we can match the project needs with the right people and the right skills from our team and make sure that, again, we're gaining wider awareness of UX around the business and user-centered design. So yeah, and also there's the point of we also look for opportunities to support the science as well as the organisation and the patient. So before joining AstraZeneca, I was kind of thinking that all of our work and our projects would be around designing directly for patients. But actually a big part of what we do is supporting the science and the business effectiveness. And in doing that, we're kind of indirectly supporting the patients as well. So some of the smartest people are spending time on kind of subpar user experiences in systems, maybe clunky, slow systems that are disjointed, as I mentioned earlier. And if we can do things that remove that burden and the frustration of going in and out of some of these bad digital experiences, it allows them to focus on the thing that they need to focus on, which is maybe sharing knowledge, collaborating better, and building upon insights, but most importantly, driving the science forward.
Cool. And just to wrap up, our intention for this talk was not to stand in front of you and stand in front of the UX community and say, oh my God, we have it so hard in pharma, you know. But we wanted to share our stories and share our experiences and share our challenges. There's not that many of us, and perhaps we're not very good at you know, joining our voices with the wider UX community. But we just wanted to say, you know, hi, we're here, we're doing UX in pharma, and it's slightly different to other industries, but we're here to sort of join our voices with the wider UX community and to help keep pushing the message of the importance of UX and work together in a community to kind of make meaningful difference to patients' lives. So that was the intention of our talk, and hopefully that's what came across. Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Filippa and Voula. That was great. I'm sure I speak for everyone on the call when we all appreciate the metaphor of thinking you're on a straight road with a sunny sky to then being on a congested road in the torrential rain. I think that's part and parcel of the jobs. There are a couple of questions, so if anyone does want to ask a question, they can raise their hand and I can unmute them, and we can do it by audio, but I see there are some in the Q&A. So I think we have a good one here about how do you address the needs, or how do you overcome difficult stakeholders and their needs? Because you mentioned you had a wide range of stakeholders, and I can imagine some of them, such as the medical consultants and the specialists, might be quite challenging to work with because what they think, the way they think something works is the right way and may not be receptive of their ideas. So how do you deal with those kind of audiences?
Do you want to do that one first?
Yeah, sure.
Your experience of the...
Yeah. You're right. There can be difficult stakeholders. And I think sometimes it's a case of proving the need for some of the things that we do, in terms of ideally proving from previous projects, the difference you've made, the impact you've made, and using kind of the UX measurements that Voula spoke a bit about earlier, to prove that this is the right way to do things. It's not always, it can be very, very tricky, obviously, and yeah, you don't always get what you want, but you can always get a bit closer, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I think that's in every industry, that design by committee model. We also experience it, and as Filippa said, I would agree. I mean, the only thing you can do is perhaps do testing, like really dirty testing, to show why you chosen to do a design the way you chosen, and which to strengthen your argument. But and apart from that, I don't see anything else you could do, really.
Well, I think one thing that we've done before is kind of going and speaking to our users and pulling out specific quotes and maybe even sharing, depending on who the users are, if they're internal people, and they're say that we're trying to redesign a system, make it a better user experience, going through a process or a system, actually kind of videoing, obviously with their permission, videoing their them having the struggles that they're seeing going through this process or system. And I think that can be really powerful as well, sharing that back with stakeholders so that they can't really argue with that evidence. So quotes and videos and audio recordings or anything like that people are happy for you to share can be super powerful as well.
I think we'll go with the second question, because this will resonate with many of our audience. So how do you go about conducting user testing or designing a system with patients? What's the best approach? I think the suggestion is it best done incrementally or through patient scenarios?
Oh, what do you mean incrementally? I mean, you mean like, should we involve users or should we do it through patient scenarios? If that's the question, then from my experience, it's best done incrementally. It's best done with real patients or real users. I think there's much more depth in the feedback that you get from real end users testing your solution or helping you co-design your solution rather than through patient scenarios. If that's the question. Is that what you thought the question was, Filippa?
That's how I understood it.
Okay, cool. Does that answer your question? I hope it does.
We are going to have to move on to the next speaker. However, the question and answer panel remain open. So Filippa and Voula, if you're happy to perhaps look at those while Rosie's speaking and answer them if you can. Like I said, we have run over time, and apologies everyone for that. But I think what I'd like to do is announce our second speaker, Rosie Webster from Babylon Health. So Rosie, if you would like to share your screen, and over to you. And you'll need to unmute yourself, Rosie.
Fabulous. Get all the text up. I hope you can all hear me and see my screen, as far as I know. Thank you for that presentation, Voula and Filippa. It was really interesting. You mentioned quite a few of the behaviours that people might want to change in around healthcare, so medication adherence, for example. So I'm going to talk to you about how to optimise your design process to give you the best chances of success when trying to change behaviours like that. Now, as Chris said, my name's Rosie. I'm currently a lead user researcher at a company called Babylon Health, but my background's very much in health. So I have a PhD in health psychology. I've been researching in the field of health for over 10 years. So I'm going to talk to you today, as I said, about how we can use health products to change people's behaviour. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have some tools and tricks up your sleeves to bring some behaviour change magic to your research and design. Now, first of all, I'd like you to just have a little think about, have you ever tried to get more active, do a bit more exercise? Have you ever had to take regular medication? But relevant more recently, but have you ever worn a mask when you're out and about? Maybe recently you've started washing your hands more. Now, these are just some of the examples of behaviours that we might need to change in ourselves and in others. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. Every action we take, whether it's putting rubbish in the right bin, muting your mic when you join a meeting, some people I work with aren't so good at that one, or perhaps keeping 2 meters apart from people, they're all behaviours. Now, we're constantly making choices about how to behave, and sometimes we make the right choices, and sometimes we don't. And right can mean a number of things. It could be a behaviour that you'd planned to do, something that your doctors told you to do, or perhaps something that helps you to achieve your goals. I'm sure many of us have planned ahead to make the healthy choice, such as ordering a salad or going to the gym after work, only to, in the moment when we're out for dinner, order the fries, or maybe decide that we'd rather sit at home with a movie instead. It can be difficult to stick to those healthy behaviours even when we've consciously made those plans in advance, especially when the alternative might be more enjoyable. In healthcare, we want people to be healthier, both for their benefit and for ours. Therefore, a big part of healthcare is supporting people in changing their behaviour, making those healthier choices. It's not easy, but hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have some tools to help you to do this. Now, having been a psychologist for many years, I'm used to people telling me that my job is common sense. People think, I'm a human, therefore I understand humans. You know, I've changed my own behaviour. I've seen other people around me change their behaviour. And I've seen products which work to change behaviour. So I know what I'm doing. It's easy, right? People might think, well, we can just nudge people. I've heard of nudge. I'm sure a lot of you have. A lot of people are very familiar with nudge. It's become very popularised in recent years. And essentially what we mean by nudging is just a very small subset of behaviour change techniques. So yes, it does work to change behaviour, but it's only one very small, narrow way to do that. It uses what we know about human behaviour and condition to kind of push and guide people towards certain changes. So the example that we can see here is using defaults such as opt out rather than opt in to increase uptake of organ donation. Now, nudge is really useful for in the moment or one-off behaviours, but health behaviours are usually much more complex than that and usually much more long-term. You might think that surely just scaring people into changing might work. So some of you will be familiar with these horrible images that we see on cigarette packets. However, the evidence shows that what we call these fear appeals only work for some people, for some behaviours and in some circumstances. And without also giving people the right tools to change when you scare them, many people will just respond defensively. So that will never happen to me. You might think that simply paying people to behave a certain way might work. And the example here is of an app called Wealth, which promises you a financial reward. And then every time you don't perform a behaviour, a little bit of that reward gets taken away. Now, there's evidence to show that this is actually an effective strategy, particularly if you're working with deprived populations. However, cost effectiveness is not clear. And normally once you stop paying people, they'll stop doing the behaviour. So the question is, do you want to pay people forever? It's not potentially a good long-term strategy. So you might think that what I'm saying is nothing works, we should just give up. But I'm not. It's just much more complex than simply choosing a solution than we've seen someone else implement. If we deliver a great solution, but it's not solving the right problem, it'll be useless. So for example, if we promise financial rewards to people if they go running every day, but those people don't own running shoes, they can't get childcare, they don't have safe spaces to go running, those rewards aren't going to help them to change their behaviour. We need to start by understanding the problem, just like in design. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the double diamond, a process that we all try to follow in our design work. In this process, we always aim to start with the problem. We then do research to discover and understand that problem space, and then we then use this to define what our solution should focus on, define the problem to be solved. Then we develop and iterate potential solutions before then refining them through testing. The behaviour change process is much the same. We start not with a solution, but by diagnosing the problem. What behaviour are we looking to change? What's driving it? What's preventing that behaviour? This diagnosis really helps us to think about where to focus in our solution. Once we've got that diagnosis, we can move on to step 2, which is to prescribe that solution. We can try and look at which solutions might give us the best chances of success. Once we have that prescription, we can then execute on them, so design and then build our solution. Lastly, but most importantly, we then evaluate whether that solution has worked to help us to learn and improve. I must say I can't take claim for these brilliantly defined and catchy steps. I've put some references on the slides and I'm going to point you in the direction of some books at the end. But as you can see, these steps map very well to the double diamond process. Designing for behaviour change isn't that different to the design process that we're all used to. We just use behavioural science to inform and guide that process. So how can we integrate behavioural science into that design process? First of all, I just want to clarify what I mean by behavioural science. Essentially, it's the systematic study of human behaviour. It includes the fields of psychology, behavioural economics, and many more. And what behavioural science gives us is theories and frameworks to help us to understand behaviour, but also evidence to show what works to change that behaviour. One of the frameworks that behavioural science gives us is this. It's the behaviour change wheel. This was created by the brilliant team at University College London, led by Professor Susan Mickey, who some of you might have seen or heard on the radio or the TV lately, talking about COVID behaviour change. Excuse me, it's a framework for understanding behaviour and designing interventions to change that behaviour. And it's devised from a number of frameworks and theories of behaviour change. And that means that you don't have to rummage through all of the hundreds of theories and frameworks that are out there. So psychologists love a theory, and we have a lot of them. What the behaviour change wheel provides you with is a one-stop shop for being able to guide your thinking. At the centre of the wheel, the green bit, we have a model of behaviour. This helps us to understand what's driving the behaviour. The next circle, the red bit, gives us ways to intervene to change that behaviour. The outer circle, the grey bit, gives us ways to intervene at a policy level. So for example, changing taxes. Now, my prior work personally has been on the individual level rather than the policy level. So I won't be focusing on that, on the grey bit today. But that's what the wheel is. How do we use it? To explain that, we need to refer back to the steps that I mentioned earlier. So diagnose, prescribe, execute, and evaluate. So step 1 is diagnose. And the first part of this is to define the behaviour that you want to change. Poorly defined behaviour makes your job much more difficult. Anyone who's ever tried to do research with poorly defined research questions will understand that. We need to define who needs to do what differently, ideally also where and when. And it can be really helpful to then think about how you'll measure it. If you're struggling to think about how to measure the behaviour, it's quite likely that you've not defined it well enough. So here's some examples of what good and bad could look like. So on the left, we have a poorly defined behaviour. So get people with diabetes to improve their self-management. Now that could improve a number of behaviours, include a number of behaviours. It's difficult to know where to start with measuring it. So it's definitely difficult to know where to start with changing it. On the right, we have a much better defined behaviour. So increase the number of people newly diagnosed with diabetes, taking their medication every day at the correct time in their home or other non-clinical setting, as measured by daily self-report. not quite so catchy, but it's well defined enough to make the rest of the process much easier for you. Once we know what we want to change, the second step of the diagnose phase is to understand that behaviour. We want to know what's driving it. Why are people doing it or not doing it? And to help us with that, at the centre of the wheel, there's a model of behaviour called the COM-B model. This helps us to understand these drivers. Again, the COM-B model is a consolidation of lots of different psychological theories, once again put together by the team at UCL, and it's a super simple framework to help us to understand behaviour. And it essentially proposes that in order for a behaviour to happen, people need three things: the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to perform the behaviour. These can be further broken down. So capability can be physical or psychological, motivation can be reflective or automatic, and opportunity can be physical or social. To give you a bit more detail and examples of what those look like, starting with physical capability. This is around having the skills, strength, or stamina to perform the behaviour. So literally, are you physically capable? So are you physically able to run 5K, for example? I'm not sure I am. Or do you have the cookery skills to cook fresh, healthy meals? Capability can also be psychological. So this might be about having the necessary knowledge. So for example, if you're diabetic, knowing what foods will raise your blood sugar levels. But it's also about having the psychological capacity to be able to make decisions about and regulate your own behaviour. So you're not feeling so overwhelmed that you can't make healthy choices and you just default to your habits. Next up, opportunity can be, first of all, physical. So this is about the environment around you, things that are external to you, particularly aspects of environment that might kind of promote or prevent the behaviour. So for example, whether you have a safe space locally to go running. But it's also about having the right resources to perform the behaviour. So for example, having the money to be able to afford fresh fruit and vegetables to support a healthy diet. Opportunity can also be social. So these are those interpersonal factors, the people around you and how that influences your behaviour. So for example, if you go out drinking and all your friends are drinking heavily, you're more likely to drink more. Lastly, probably most importantly, but unfortunately also most difficult to change, we have motivation. Now, first of all, motivation can be reflective. So this is the conscious side of you that kind of weighs up the pros and cons of the behaviour, decides, yes, this is something that would be good for me to do, and makes that conscious plan. This is the side of you that thinks, yes, I've not been particularly active, not done a lot of exercise this week, I'm going to go to the gym after I finish work tonight. On the other side, we then have automatic motivation. Now, these are processes such as impulses, desires, wants, and needs, which drive us towards or away from certain behaviours in the moment. So eating the cake because it tastes so damn good, or maybe eating chocolate in the evening after you've had dinner because it's a habit and it's what you always do. Unfortunately, you can see how automatic motivation can sometimes outweigh that reflective motivation. So this is then the side of you that after you've made that plan to go to the gym, you get to the end of the day and you're a bit tired and you think, actually, I'd much rather go home and sit on the sofa. And we use this COM-B model to conduct what's called a behavioural diagnosis. And we do this by, we conduct research to understand which of these drivers are most important. Is it capability, opportunity, or motivation, or some combination of the three? There's various ways that we can do this, but I would always start, as with most research, with looking at the literature. So it's quite likely that many academic researchers have always looked into the behaviour you're trying to change, so use their findings to inform your thinking. Secondly, it always helps to do qualitative research with the target population. It's unlikely that you'll find literature on the exact behaviour in the end and the exact population. So this can help you then to explore those drivers from your literature review further and see whether they apply to the population that you're trying to deal with. Lastly, in addition to or instead of qualitative research, you might want to run a survey. And this can help us to size those different COM-B drivers, to prioritise which ones to go after. And the idea is that what we have at the end of this process is a prioritised list of those COM-B drivers which we'll want to target with your product or feature. So once we go into our second diamond, these are the things that we're taking forward. So just to kind of give you an example, the example behaviour that we mentioned earlier around people with diabetes taking their medication every day at the right time, assume that we've gone away and we've looked at the literature and we've done some qualitative research. And we found that one key barrier repeatedly comes up. And that's that people are managing a lot of behavioural changes after they're diagnosed with diabetes. So they're told to change their diet, to do more exercise, maybe to quit smoking, drink less alcohol, and potentially also take this medication as well on top of all of that. And as a result, they keep forgetting to take their medication. They've got too much to think about. This seems like it'd be a problem with psychological capability. So this is the issue that we then take forward to the next stage. which is prescribe. So once we have our prioritised driver or drivers, we can start to think about the solutions that might be most effective for changing those drivers. And for this, we can go back to the wheel, where the red part gives us broad methods of interventions that we call intervention functions. Now, they are education, persuasion, incentivization, coercion, training, enablement, modelling, environmental restructuring, and restrictions. Quite a few to choose from, as you can see. Just to give you a couple of examples of what those might look like, here on the right we have persuasion. So this is around using communication to induce feelings and emotional reaction to persuade people to behave a certain way. So for example, communicating the impact their behaviour might have on their family. Over on the left at the top, we have what we call environmental restructuring. So changing the environment around them, whether that be physical or social. So for example, getting them to leave their trainers by the bed so that they remember to go running first thing in the morning. Or maybe if they're trying to quit smoking, don't see your friends who smoke. And then lastly, we also have enablement. Now, this is essentially just providing support or measures which really help to make performing that behaviour easier for the person. And this can include a wide range of things. So, for example, social support or providing people with the resources that they need. Now, the wheel helpfully maps these intervention functions to the COM-B drivers. So, for example, if we know that psychological capability is our issue, we can use education, training, or enablement to try and change that. And then we can also get a little bit more granular. So at the next level down, we can then start to define what we call behaviour change techniques. Now, these are the smallest active ingredient of a behaviour change intervention. So in the same way that we heard about AstraZeneca run drugs trials to understand the effectiveness of drugs, they will have lots of active ingredients. A behaviour change intervention also has active ingredients, and these are behaviour change techniques. There's a taxonomy of 93 of them. I'm not going to read all of those out, don't worry, that you can see here. And they give us evidence-based ideas for ways to change behaviour. And once again, these are helpfully mapped to the COM-B drivers. So I've put a link there to a tool which shows us the amount of evidence linking the drivers to different BCTs. So you can see what might be effective for the intervention you're developing. So what you'll likely come out with off the back of that process is a list of intervention functions and behaviour change techniques that you could potentially use. And you then need to choose which ones to take forward. Once again, to do this, we'd start by looking at the literature. To see what other people have done and what's been effective. We also need to think about what's ethical. So, for example, there's an intervention function called coercion and a BCT of punishment. These might not be particularly ethical to use in healthcare. Lastly, we also need to think about what's practical. For example, if we're delivering something that's purely digital or online, we might need to rule out certain techniques that are best delivered face-to-face. So if we go back to our example from earlier, where psychological capability was the issue with medication adherence, we know from looking at that table I showed earlier that the suggested intervention functions are education, training, and enablement. The issue isn't with knowledge or ability, so education or training might not be that useful. It seems like people might need some support to make the behaviour easier, so enablement might help us here. In terms of behaviour change techniques, there are two suggested techniques which might help us. The first one is prompts and cues. So providing people with little either reminders or say putting their medication in a place where, you know, next to their toothbrush or something like that to remind themselves to take them. But we could also use the BCT that we call conserving mental resources. So this might be, for example, advising them to focus less on other behaviour changes. So don't worry about the diet and lifestyle for now. Let's just get the medication adherence nailed. So you're taking away some of the overwhelming that they've got. And then once we've chosen those intervention functions and behaviour change techniques, we can then start to think about executing on our intervention. So designing and building it. So if we return back to our double diamond, this is where we're now completing the second diamond in a very similar way to you would do for any product or feature. And a useful first step for this, as I'm sure you all know, is an ideation workshop. So we would bring along the behaviour change techniques and intervention functions that we've identified, but also potentially some inspiration from other products who are trying to change similar behaviours. And lastly, also bring along that reminder of who and what you're designing for. So who's the population, what's the behaviour, and what are the COM-B drivers that you've identified. Now, the main challenge facing these workshops is keeping everyone focused on those behaviour change techniques and behavioural drivers, and not just coming up with unrelated grand ideas that they've perhaps seen somewhere. We need to make sure that the solution is solving the problem that we've identified. That said, we don't want to hamper creativity too much. So if people come up with some really great ideas that seem outside of scope, trace it back, walk it back through the process, walk back to your behavioural drivers. Is this thing solving something that's a real issue that you've identified? If so, great. It's not a problem if your feature or product solves for multiple drivers and includes multiple BCTs. And once this process is complete, we then just use the normal design and testing process, however it works in your company. And finally, the last step is to evaluate. So think about what works and how to improve. Now, once again, if we go back to our double diamond, the process doesn't end when we get to the solution. We evaluate, and that evaluation can feed us back either to the very beginning of the process with further problem exploration. So, for example, understanding the behaviour more deeply or understanding a new behaviour. Or it could take us back to the middle of the process with solution ideation. So look at what worked and what didn't, and think about how the solution could be changed or added to or adapted to make it even more effective. It's important that we think carefully at this point about what to measure. We don't just want to measure one thing. We'll probably measure multiple things to help us to understand how and why things worked. To start with, we should always take a baseline measurement. So before you implement anything, measure your behaviour and any relevant outcomes so that you can see that change over time. For example, with the medication adherence example in diabetes we talked about earlier, we might start by measuring baseline medication usage. Next, we want to understand exposure to the intervention. So if people don't use the feature or product, it won't have any impact. And if behaviours have changed and they've not used it, then it was nothing to do with you. It was just pure chance. So you might want to look at things like analytics, such as logins, pages viewed, etc. Next up, we want to measure those combi drivers that we're trying to change. So for our example, we want to measure that psychological capability. So maybe how overwhelmed people are feeling or how often they've forgotten to take their medication. Lastly, but probably most importantly, we also want to measure that long-term outcome that we're really interested in. Why are we even changing the behaviour in the first place? So in our diabetes example, a long-term clinical measure like HbA1c might be used, but it might be something like, lowering blood pressure or weight loss. The idea of measuring all of these factors is so that if something does or doesn't work, then we'll know why or why not. So for example, if there's no change in your driver, so for example, people don't feel any more motivated, perhaps the solution needs work. Maybe you need to do a better job at driving that motivational change. If the driver changes, so people feel more motivated, but the behaviour didn't change, maybe you've not uncovered the most important driver of that behaviour. Maybe you also need to be targeting something else. If the behaviour changes but the long-term outcome doesn't, perhaps you should be targeting a different behaviour. Maybe something else might have more impact. So this process will really help to guide you with where in the process to go back to before you try again. So, key takeaways. First of all, when designing for behaviour change, start by understanding the behaviour, understand that problem, and then think about your solutions. Behavioural science frameworks like the Behaviour Change Wheel can really help to supercharge your design process and give you the best chance of success. And remember, the steps that can help us with that are diagnose, prescribe, execute, evaluate. Now, just to finish up, I promised to recommend you a couple of books. The first one is the Behaviour Change Wheel Guide. So the framework that I've introduced here, this book goes into much more detail with lots of great case studies. And also on the right, a book called Engage by Amy Bucher, who's a brilliant behaviour change designer in the US. She does a really great job of kind of bringing in the principles of the behaviour change wheel with other design and behavioural theories at the same time. So I highly recommend that. Thank you very much. Hoping we've got sufficient time to take some questions.
Thank you, Rosie. That was brilliant. I think we do have time for some questions if you're happy to stay on. One may have already been answered, but I think we'll go for it anyway.
Okay.
It's in the Q&A panel, and it's in addition to the capability, motivation, and opportunity. Would you also include the trigger or hint? So
I'm not really sure what it means by hint. I can understand what it means by a trigger, so something that kind of like tips you over the edge. So yes, that's definitely something that's worth thinking about. Normally that kind of thing would come up. So you'll find capability and opportunity motivation do tend to cover a lot of things. But what can be really useful is when you're doing this is often we kind of focusing on one main behaviour, but we're often looking at lots of little events that happen along the way. So when you're doing your behavioural analysis and you're doing your research, you would look into that and flag those kinds of things. But often you'll find the trigger will be something that, for example, gives a drastic increase in motivation, for example.
Thanks, Rosie. I have a question. We'll open up to others in a moment. And I apologise if it's a difficult one. During this time, especially, we've been subject to mixed messages.
Yes.
So we've had, one part of the government or the scientific community telling us one thing, and then we're hearing a different message from other sources. If you are trying to influence change, how do you adapt to cope with the fact that someone is getting another source of information or might be getting influenced externally?
Oh, I thought it was going to be an easy question, which is that bad? And yes, of course it is bad, which is obvious. So it's obviously best for people to have one clear source of truth and information. What I would say is when you're trying to do that, I think that try and find out who the most trusted source of information is for people. And in the UK, generally that's the NHS. So if you can if we know what the science says, ideally we should be getting the NHS to recommend that those behaviours, if that makes sense. So it's there's a behaviour change technique called credible source. So using the right credible source to kind of communicate that would be really helpful. And hopefully that would override some of the difficulties with, so for example, some people trust the government over scientists, some people trust scientists over the government. I would suspect, my hypothesis would be, is that people trust the NHS over both of those things. So that kind of would be my advice. But ultimately the answer is don't give mixed messages, but unfortunately we don't have much control over that.
Okay, there's a couple more. I'll go to the attendees panel. I see someone has raised a hand. If you just give me a moment to unmute that person. I just need to scroll through the list. It's Alex. Alex, did we answer your question, or do you have another one? You should be able to.
Actually, I do have another question for Rosie. So, awesome talk. I'm sure a lot of people feel the same, and I do look at this kind of behavioral design and research, and I'm just curious. I've heard in actually psychotherapy, one issue is once someone becomes aware of the method of the technique, it kind of loses its efficacy. And given how much, to put it bluntly, stubbornness and sort of resistance there is in the pandemic, how do you see approaching that kind of awareness of your behavioral methods and techniques?
I mean, I think it really depends on the kind of technique you're using. So a lot of techniques are actually quite transparent. But I suppose if you take some things like nudge, some of them kind of might seem a little bit more covert, I guess. And some people kind of don't really like that kind of feeling like that their behaviour is being manipulated. I guess I kind of take the stance that you're much more likely for people to have a positive response to that if you're trying to push them towards kind of a behaviour that they want to change to start with, which often in health we are. It's just that people want to change but they just can't quite get there. Or a behaviour change that's kind of for their own good. I mean, I'm all for transparency. And I also think that there are lots of techniques that still work even when you do know about them. So a really good example that from my own life is something called implementation intentions, which are essentially just if-then plans. So you identify a trigger and then a response to that trigger and kind of rehearse it and repeat it and get it stuck in your head. And I use it all the time to try and remind myself to do things, and it works. So yeah, I guess it's difficult, I think, kind of finding the balance between transparency. But yeah, I don't think that it negates the effect, if that makes sense.
Perfect, thank you.
There was a question from Johnny in the chat. Is there any differentiation on behaviours, e.g. some are habits, some are more short-term or cultural, and does it affect the behavioural change model?
So, I mean, we would define them all as behaviours. It's just a case of when and for how long you're asking people to do those behaviours. So when you're defining it, it might be that it's just a one-off thing, like the organ donation sign-up example, or it might be something, you know, you're asking people to do 30 minutes of activity every day. you know, that's part of the definition, the fact that you're asking people to like how much or how frequently you're asking somebody to do something. I wouldn't say that the kind of model or framework that you use is different, but you'll likely find different barriers. So when you do that behavioural diagnosis using the COM-B model, you'll quite likely find that for something like a long-term behaviour, something like habit is likely to have a strong influence on it, which is quite different to kind of some of the other more short-term behaviours. And as I say, you're much more likely to use strategies like nudge type things for kind of the one-off behaviours. Hope that answers your question.
I think there's another question in the Q&A. Have you found any limitations to using the behaviour change wheel?
Yes, I would say. I mean, with every theory and framework has some limitations. So I've literally been using it myself. We've been running a behavioural diagnosis for a project this week. And I think sometimes there are things that sort of, first of all, might sit outside of the domain. So it's very comprehensive, but there are still sometimes certain things that are kind of important to take into account. So for example, I think one of the things I was trying to fit in was like a very specific aspect of the care they received and how that influenced their behaviour, and it was difficult to see where that fit into those kind of COM-B domains. But another issue is that things, particularly things related to human behaviour, are often very complex and not clear-cut. So you'll often find that something feels like, oh, well, that could fit in two things. So that could be reflective motivation, but it could also be psychological capability. Which I think is fine. I think what I would do is kind of see where it most likely sits, and or kind of like hedge your bets. So if you think it's kind of these things that straddles these two different dimensions, it's going to give you more intervention functions and BCTs to kind of to tackle it. So yeah, so it's not always clear cut in terms of like where things sit when you're coding.
Thank you. There is another question, but I think that might be for our AZ speakers. Unfortunately, they made a special trip to the office for this talk, so they probably had to drop off early and vacate. But if anyone has a final question specifically for Rosie, either in the Q&A or is happy to ask it. I'm not seeing anyone.
I can see a question in the Q&A that is interesting, if you would like to answer that. So I can see one from Joel around intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So how does intrinsic and extrinsic motivation relate to reflective and automatic motivation? So I think there's kind of a lot of overlap in those kinds of things, and how I would say it maps is that extrinsic motivation tends to be much more on the reflective side of things, whereas intrinsic is much more on the automatic side of things. But anyone who's familiar with kind of that intrinsic motivation distinction is that that's very much like a scale. It's a continuum. So I wouldn't say that they neatly kind of like fall into one or the other. But automatic motivation definitely is at one end of that spectrum, and reflective is at the other.
Okay. In that case, I think we will bring an end to the proceedings. I'd like to thank all of the speakers, Rosie and Filippa and Voula from AstraZeneca. The session is being recorded, so once we have saved it and trimmed it slightly, it does go on the UXPA UK YouTube account. So you will be able to re-watch the talks if there's anything you want to go over again. Rosie, there were some links in your slides, so if you're happy for those to be shared, what we'll do is the event will go as a past event on the UXPA UK website, and it will be available there. I think that's all from me. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasant evening, and I know we have a bit more freedom, so thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon, and certainly join us next month in August. Thank you very much, everyone.